The world's richest nation, United States of America, is drowning in debt. $36 trillion and counting. And here's the twist. The US didn't fall into debt, but it was born in it. From revolution to recession, every war, every president, every crisis has come with a price tag. In this video, we'll trace the entire history of America's national debt, how it began with borrowed money to fight the British, ballooned during world wars, exploded after 9/11, and now threatens to crush the US economy under its own weight. If we say the United States was born in debt, we wouldn't be too far from the truth. America's journey into independence, the Revolutionary Wars fought between 1775 and 1783, were funded almost entirely through debt. There was no federal government back then, no national financial system, and certainly no tax collection infrastructure in place. The US Treasury Department didn't even exist. It was created in 1781 during the war itself. To fund the war against the British, the Founding Fathers borrowed money from Dutch bankers, the French government, and wealthy individuals within the colonies. Since the colonies had no working taxation system and were literally fighting against British taxation, it would have been foolish to try to fund the war by taxing the very people who were revolting. It could have easily cost them public support. By the end of the war in 1783, America's national debt had already hit $43 million. Then came the War of 1812, fought against Britain once again, this time over maritime rights and British support for Native American resistance to US expansion. The war began with $45 million in national debt and ended in 1816 with the debt nearly tripled to $119 million. But for one brief moment in history, the US actually had no national debt. That happened during the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. Jackson managed to wipe out the debt entirely by selling vast tracts of public land in the Western territories and slashing federal spending, particularly on infrastructure. And it's worth noting that just a few decades earlier, in 1803, the US had pulled off arguably the largest real estate deal in human history, the Louisiana Purchase. For a mere $15 million, the US bought 828,000 square miles of land from France, an area roughly the size of Saudi Arabia. The government later sold that land to settlers, and the revenue was instrumental in paying off debt. Then came another war, the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. This led to the US acquiring present-day California, Texas, and 6 other states, adding 529,000 square miles of land to the country. But it also added to the national debt. By the time the Civil War broke out in 1860, the US debt stood at $65 million. But war is expensive, and the Civil War was no exception. By the end of the war in 1866, debt had skyrocketed to $2.7 billion. Since then, US debt has never fallen below $1.5 billion. Some economists argue that America is still paying the price for the Civil War to this day. However, after the war, debt did decline as a percentage of GDP, thanks to a growing post-war economy. Just a year after the Civil War ended, in 1867, the US made another massive land purchase, Alaska. Bought from Russia for only $7.2 million, this land was about the size of modern-day Libya, which is the 16th largest country in the world. From there, US debt continued to evolve. A short war with Spain in 1898 didn't add much, and by the eve of World War I in 1915, the national debt stood at just $3 billion. But World War I changed that. By 1920, US debt had ballooned to $26 billion. Then came the Great Depression. In response to the 1929 stock market crash and the economic devastation of the 1930s, the US government ramped up public spending. By the time World War II began, debt had reached $40 billion. World War II took things to a whole new level. By the war's end in 1945, US national debt had exploded to $259 billion. The total cost of the war for the US was around $323 billion, which, adjusted for inflation, is about $5.8 trillion today. Most of that money was raised by selling treasury bonds to American citizens. Despite this, the post-war economy boomed. In the 1950s, the Korean War didn't significantly impact debt levels. But in 1966, the US introduced Medicare, a massive federal health program for the elderly and disabled. It's one of the most expensive federal commitments to this day. Then came the Vietnam War. In 1965, the U.S. national debt was $317 billion. By the end of the war in 1976, it had doubled to $620 billion. The 1980s brought in Ronald Reagan, and with him, tax cuts and a surge in military spending as the Cold War escalated. This created a double whammy, reduced government revenue and higher expenditures. Between 1980 and 1989, U.S. national debt tripled, from $907 billion to $2.85 trillion. Debt kept rising through the presidencies of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. By the year 2000, it stood at $5.65 trillion. Then came George W. Bush. By the time he left office in 2009, the national debt had more than doubled, from $5.8 trillion to $11.9 trillion. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone added $1.2 trillion. Tax cuts for individuals and corporations, along with the $700 billion bailout of Wall Street during the 2008 financial crisis, also contributed massively to the surge. Barack Obama took over in 2009, and in his 8 years, national debt rose another 70%, from $11.9 trillion to $20.2 trillion. The fallout from the 2008 crisis demanded major government spending, and Obama's administration also expanded Social Security and provided tax relief. Then came Donald Trump. By the end of his term in January 2021, the debt had jumped again by another $8 trillion. The biggest factor? COVID-19. The pandemic alone added over $4 trillion in spending. On top of that, Trump's tax cuts and a rise in defense spending fueled further debt. Under President Joe Biden, the national debt has already surged by a staggering $8 trillion. And now, as his term wraps up in January 2025, the U.S. national debt has officially crossed the $36 trillion mark. Yes, you heard that right, $36 trillion. It's not a projection anymore, it's a reality. Why? Well, a combination of things. The lingering economic impact of COVID-19, rising interest payments on previous debt, the war in Ukraine, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and programs like student loan forgiveness. Now here's the shocking part. Back in 1990, the U.S. national debt was just $3 trillion. Today, that number has grown 12-fold to $36 trillion, and without a single major territorial expansion or decisive military victory since then. In fact, America's military might today isn't vastly stronger than it was in 1990, though it's certainly more technologically advanced. Meanwhile, Russia has re-emerged as a military threat, and China has become a full-blown economic superpower. And yet, America's budget continues to run annual deficits in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The government keeps plugging these gaps by issuing bonds, essentially borrowing money at interest. In recent years, the pace has become staggering. On average, every 100 days, the U.S. adds another $1 trillion to its national debt. And here's where it gets even more alarming. Interest payments. In 2015, the U.S. paid $223 billion in interest on its debt. By 2020, that number had grown to $345 billion. In 2024, $881 billion, nearly 3 times as much. By the end of the financial year 2025, it is projected to surpass $1 trillion, and so far, it has already reached $489 billion. In 2024, the United States spent more on interest payments, just interest, than on Medicare. And even more than the entire U.S. defense budget, which is a mind-blowing $881 billion. Think about that for a second. America, the world's largest military power, spent nearly $1 trillion on defense, and still paid more just to service its debt. That's not investment. That's not building the future. That's just keeping the financial sinkhole from collapsing. So here's the big question. If interest payments are now bigger than national healthcare or military spending, where is the U.S. economy headed? Let us know what you think in the comments. Is this sustainable? Or is America silently sliding into a debt-driven crisis? We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you found this history insightful, hit the like button, share with a friend, and subscribe for more deep dives into global economics and power politics.